Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast. The P.A.S. Report provides an honest analysis on the critical issues that matter to you without the biased media filters. Here's your host, Professor Nicholas Giordano.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P.A.S. Report. This is your host, Nick Giordano. I hope you had a great weekend out there. And I do have to say, the Biden classified document saga is continuing. They're finding more classified documents in his home in Delaware. And it really is amazing how these people, and it's a lot of politicians, that they constantly project. They'll constantly criticize their political opponents of doing exactly what they do. People in glass houses shouldn't throw stones, but apparently none of the politicians realize that. So it's just something to take note of. Now, I will talk a little bit about the classified documents on Wednesday. I'm not going to get into it in this episode because I have a great guest today, the author of American Ingrate, Ilhan Omar, and the Progressive Islamist Takeover of the Democratic Party. He's here. Ben Weingarten is also the deputy editor of Real Clear Investigations, a senior contributor at the Federalist, a fellow at the Claremont Institute, and he writes columns for Newsweek, Epoch Times, and others out there. I suggest you read his book and the columns because his columns are always fascinating. They're always informative. They're interesting. So make sure you check them out. I have the links up at the PAS Report website. And while you're there, don't forget to sign up for the newsletter and follow the podcast so you don't miss an episode. If you find the show informative, share it with your family and friends. With that out of the way, I want to welcome Ben Weingarten to the PAS Report. Ben, glad you could join me. How are you today?
Well, I appreciate that. I'm doing well, and thanks so much for having me.
It's like every column I want to talk about that you wrote over the course of like the last 3 weeks, because I think each and every one of them are really that important. And I want to start with the one that I just read, which is your visit with the Academy, with people that feel that they've been marginalized, they've been silenced. Can you explain to the audience what's happening out there, particularly on the campuses at college? Because I regularly speak about that.
Yeah, well, this, is not a surprising theme necessarily to me, but it's certainly a demoralizing one because what is the Academy at the end of the day? The Academy, especially institutions of higher education, are supposed to be about intellectual discourse, debating new ideas, figuring out ways to better understand the world and think critically and come up with solutions to problems that we face. The Academy has essentially turned against itself, particularly among these elite institutions. It has become not only closed-minded to the extent that it silences opposing views actively and claims that those views constitute harm and then uses that as a justification to silence. And of course, we've seen this now manifest itself out in the real world in a slew of different ways. But it's also, of course, about propagating a particular worldview and that worldview alone. And if you do not comport with effectively the party line, then you can well find yourself smeared, shunned, if not canceled or worse. And I observed this recently in a very narrow sense, but I think it provides a window into the broader one, which is I was working on this piece on University of Pennsylvania Business School, Wharton, one of the most prestigious, obviously, business schools in the country. And Wharton is number one. Wharton's first at making ESG for business, that's environmental, social governance factors, as I'm sure your listeners well know, for business, as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion majors for MBAs. And by the way, at the undergraduate level as well, these are going to be concentrations that students can focus on as they pursue their degrees there. So I reached out to a series of people at Wharton, current students, faculty, graduates as well, to find out, is there any resistance to ESGB and DEI being elevated within the school? Because these are obviously highly contentious issues by their nature. The notion that businesses ought to do good and that so-called do good and that by doing good, they'll be more profitable, and this manifests itself, of course, in net zero, carbon neutrality types of policies within companies, mandated diversity in terms of race, ethnicity, and board composition, and essentially going out there and using businesses as a vehicle to engage in progressive activism and to further progressive goals. And obviously, DEI is even more radical by its very nature. And, so I sought out, is there any resistance? And on what basis is there that resistance? And To their credit, there were some people who were willing to speak with me, but the fact that there was even a hesitation among anyone to speak, I think, is incredibly telling. And then to a man of the around a dozen or so people who I daisy chained into being sources for this story, almost every single one said, well, let's just state at the outset, you're not going to use my name, right? And, you can use this quote, you can't use this quote, but I'm giving this information to you on background. And we're talking about essentially just, do you have principled grounds for questioning whether or not ESG and DEI should be majors at one of the most prominent business schools in the country? Simple question, shouldn't be something that causes people to have fear. I mean, we shouldn't have fear about expressing ideas anyway. And look, there's obviously a natural tension, particularly if you're inside an institution, of taking a position that challenges that institution's line. But even for alums out in the business world with very good jobs, and probably jobs where even if their coworkers know about their political views, it should have no bearing whatsoever on their day-to-day, still, all of them essentially were very cautious about what could be printed and what couldn't be printed. Among some, particularly faculty who didn't have tenure, they would not speak to me. They basically said, I appreciate what you're doing, but I'd prefer not to talk about this. And that sort of chilled atmosphere on the campus, which is supposed to allow for the fostering of debate and a consideration of a number of ideas, and we know it hasn't worked out that way. But the fact that it's like that on campus at elite institutions on very contentious issues by their very nature, and then that it extends out into the real world is a very disturbing thing. And we've all heard about the cancel culture on campuses, radical leftism within campuses. But now it manifests itself in the real world in a very chilled manner. And it makes it so that, of course, we are all living on the campus now. And this is going to create a self-perpetuating cycle here because you have a wokening commercial sector in this country. You have the schools which are going to feed that sector with more people who have imbibed this kind of anti-gospel. And it's going to continue to perpetuate itself and manifest itself in all of our influential institutions. So that's a very roundabout way of saying I saw this up close, how concerned people were, how fearful, confident people who would know how to phrase their answers in a way that was very careful, diplomatic, even-handed, and even they did not want to touch these issues. And there's an ever-expanding universe of issues that you simply apparently can't touch in polite society in America. And that's a real tragedy.
Well, I mean, I'm surrounded with other professors all the time. We're constantly talking. And a lot of it has to do with professors are cowards. They don't like going. And I'm talking about even the ones with tenure a lot of times will not speak up out of fear that they're going to be ostracized or marginalized in their departments. But the truth is, I'm hearing from professors on the left where we disagree about almost everything politically and how frightened and terrified they are of what's happening, what's taking place on these campuses. And I asked myself, well, why don't you speak up then? I mean, if we're on the front lines, it comes from us, especially the professors that have tenure, to speak up because, yeah, we may be ostracized, but guess what? If we don't speak up now, I mean, I work in the SUNY outfit, right? So in SUNY, and I don't know if you know this, but they're now building out DEI principles into degree programs. So it's not like, if someone just majors in DEI, which is a ridiculous major, just as ridiculous as basket weaving, if someone majors in DEI, fine, that's them. Now it's being built out into degree programs where any major that you want to take, you're going to have to take, quote unquote, approved DEI courses. That's terrifying to me.
Yeah, and at Wharton and at other schools as well, there's also talk of, and let's step back here because one of the reasons this is so interesting is Wharton, we're talking about a business school. So what does DEI have to do with preparing the next generation of entrepreneurs or executives? We're not talking about a school that's focused on, the kinds of soft disciplines that would lend themselves to a DEI or environmentalist kind of focus, but they're talking about how do we incorporate these principles into our core curriculum? So and
doesn't it go exactly to the opposite of what a business school should be? Instead of focusing on principles of capitalism, they're going to focus on principles of equity?
Well, they will make the argument, the proponents of it, that this is ultimately going to be good for business. We can debate that. And obviously, returns among those companies that have high, quote unquote, ESG ratings for the last year have been terrible. and it's put them in a real kind of cognitive dissonance sort of situation where, do we have to be pro Western oil companies because Putin's on the other side of this? And it puts them in all sorts of binds when the real world kind of conflicts with what the agenda is. But obviously, I think there's a great argument to be made, and I've made this argument in my opinion writing, that look, promoting people on the basis of their skin color or their political ideology has to be detrimental ultimately, because what is a business about? It's about merit. It's about making the best widget at the lowest price or serving your customers in a way that's superior to some other competitor. And so if you're going to prioritize other factors there, and not even to get into contributing actual dollars, investing time and resources into them, you're ultimately going to undermine your company, and you're going to undermine the entire system, on which our capitalist foundation is based. But yeah, to the broader point of, we're talking business schools here, and so you're going to have a basic accounting course and it's sort of an entry level accounting course at a Wharton, and it's going to have DEI and ESG principles baked into it. I mean, part of this is this like a vanity project essentially? The people who can afford to go to these schools and have the right credentials, and the corporations that are going to employ them, this is sort of a social justice kind of veneer that they can wear as a shield to protect themselves. But there are obviously true believers within these academies as well, and it obviously has a real impact out in the world.
Well, I look at them as the moral holy warriors. And unfortunately, a lot of people like to put the blame on Gen Z and the current generation that's growing up and whatnot. But really, it's the baby boomers, the Gen X, Gen Y. It's all of our fault because we've allowed this to happen. I mean, I just wrote a piece for Campus Reform where it was Gen X and the millennials that actually created the safe spaces, that approved of safe spaces. They were the ones that approved of lockdowns along with the baby boomers and socially isolating Gen Z. And now these Gen Z students are coming in without the knowledge that they're supposed to, because they lost, a year or two of academic learning. They were already behind because standards were already lowered, and it's a complete disaster out there. So how, as a nation, can we survive if the trend continues?
I think that is the ultimate question. We can talk about a whole slew of problems that we have that are so far downstream from the fundamental one, and I think the fundamental one is the corrupting of the American mind. There was Bloom's closing of the American mind. I think it's the corrupting of the American mind. And look, I went to Columbia. I graduated in 2010. So it was leftist, obviously, then. And I think when I was looking at the school, described it as militantly leftist. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was invited to speak on campus when I was there. I've seen a devolution in a decade that kind of puts on steroids the worst of what I was seeing at that particular time. But it starts well before you get to college. And in this piece I wrote on Wharton, one of the alums was saying, well, look, the kind of inculcation in the progressive worldview, which of course manifests itself in the ESG and DEI and various other theories as well, that's baked in well before you get to business school. It's baked in well before you get to undergrad. And when you start to peel back the layers, I have two small children. You can see it already going into pre-kindergarten, the level of indoctrination. I saw a book. There's a children's book, A is for Activist. And I'm sure if you go into any major bookstore, you can find all of this sorts of literature out there. The propagandization is so intense from the start. And so really the only counter programming that kids have is what books and other materials and entertainment do you expose your children to? But outside of those hours with your kids, to the extent they're in a school and they're not homeschooled, they are likely going to be indoctrinated in the very worldview that ultimately manifests itself in just a more hyper-intellectualized version when you get to higher education. So it ultimately, at the end of the day, I think virtually all the problems that plague us can be traced back to this corruption of education and indoctrination in a worldview that's inherently antithetical to that on which our country was based. And so that goes to, obviously, not the system wouldn't argue it's failing. I think the system would argue that it's succeeding in churning out generation after generation of social justice warrior, or whatever the lexicon is going to be to describe them. But then it comes down to families as well. And part of the problem is that it's sort of a generational struggle, because if the parents were indoctrinated in it, their kids are likely going to be indoctrinated. If it was 2 generations back, you're already dealing with multi-generations. And so the only answers are you have to put out superior ideas. People have to see in their own lives the failing of these worldviews and how it ultimately undermines everything it purports to be about. It's remarkable in a sense. In some ways, I'm very pessimistic about where we are, as you could probably tell from what I'm saying. But in some ways, I could say there's room for optimism for 2 reasons. One, we're still roughly a 50-50 country politically, even though within each of those 50%, there's a small percentage on each side that kind of constitutes the true believers on each side. But it's remarkable, given where these institutions are, that it's about 50-50 still, when you have an entire media and the schools and pretty much the entire political system and beyond, funded with our taxpayer dollars, of course, when it comes to public education as well. And then the other aspect is look at the other side, where the left was, and when the left started its march through these institutions 100 years ago or so. They were a far smaller percentage of the country than our conservatives, traditional American thinkers today. And they were able to triumph. This fringe radical group that themselves was marginalized and had these theories that were totally out of whack with where society is. However, they were deathly serious about their worldview ultimately triumphing. And in the face of people who want to go about their lives and live the way Americans have always lived and pursue happiness as they see fit, the opposition that wants to dominate is always going to win in that sort of balance. So, I see room for optimism, but I think, to your point about how do we survive, it's a cliche thing. It does come down to the children. The left realizes it, and that's why they start from the earliest days in school, indoctrinating them in their worldview.
And I would say that it goes even before that. If you look at Nick Jr. and Disney and Sesame Street, and the left actually controls nearly every institution, whether it's academia, whether it's entertainment, whether it's government and politics. So it is frightening. But here's the amazing part. I suspect, I don't have the data to prove it, but I suspect that 90% of parents out there would agree with me that trans issues shouldn't be taught to children in K through 3. This shouldn't even be an issue that we're debating publicly, because most people say that, no, you shouldn't be pushing gender issues on children. And yet here we are. So it shows you how powerful this fringe is, the fringe minority, and how they've taken over. One thing Republicans are really good at is pointing out the problems. I mean, it's easy to identify the problems when you actually look, but it's always easy to point out the problems. My question that I want to take up, we're going to take a short break. What I want to take up after the break is, what's the solution to the problems? Ultimately, that's what we have to get to. What are the goals and what are the solutions? What do we want to accomplish? So let's take a quick break, and when we get back, we're going to take that question up. As someone who worked in emergency management, I routinely sounded the alarm bells on our outdated grid system. Think back to 2003 when a tree branch hit a power line in Ohio, shutting down power to the entire eastern seaboard. Around 100 people died, and this was one of the costliest disasters in American history, with losses totaling over $60 billion. Even the White House sees it. They're saying 2/3 of the grid are at least 25 years old, and they recently announced billions of dollars to update it. But we're talking about the government here. How long do you think that's going to take, if at all? When an incident happens, you have to rely on yourself. Be prepared for yourself and your family. With the Patriot Power Generator, you get a solar generator that doesn't install into your house because it's portable. You can take it with you, even use it inside. But it's powerful enough for your phones, medical devices, and even your fridge. Right now, you can go to 4patriots.com, use code P.A.S. to get 10% off your first purchase on anything in the store, including the Patriot Power Generator. You'll also get their famous guarantee for an entire year after your order, plus free shipping on orders over $97. A portion of every sale is donated to charities who support veterans and their families. Just go to 4patriots.com, use code PAS to get 10% off. That's 4patriots.com, use code PAS to get yours today. The question is, what do we do to push back? I know you said that we create superior institutions, but haven't conservatives largely ignored going into government, going into civil service, going into academia? And now that they're finally starting to wake up, it's almost as if we have to play catch up. But even worse, we're playing catch up, and there's so many that fear that if they speak out, they're going to be publicly shamed, humiliated, or their livelihoods are going to be destroyed.
Yeah, it's a multifaceted problem. And I think there are a few things we could say. First is, and obviously we've seen this with Governor DeSantis in Florida. We saw this with President Trump on specific issues, notable issues. We've seen this with a handful of other Republican politicians as well. I think conservatives inherently don't like the idea of using power. Like, we'd rather get rid of all of these institutions. And that's good and well, of course. However, to the extent you are going to have these rotten institutions, the first thing you have to say is we must stop this bleeding and stop funding, subsidizing, essentially providing protection to those institutions that hate our guts and want us dead, figuratively speaking. So to that end, that means defund. That means take away privileges to institutions. That means strip back protections for administrative agencies that should not have those protections. But beyond that, then there has to be a positive agenda as well. And I've come around to the idea at a high level, at least, that the notion of neutrality, that's not the other side clearly is not neutral. They believe in driving home their worldview using every single lever of power possible. So it's one thing to take those levers of power and say, I'm not going to fund their worldview. But there is also inherently a worldview that's baked into all of our institutions as well. Our institutions are not values neutral. Justice is a real value. Liberty is a real value. So to that end, there needs to be a positive agenda on the other side as well. I think we're just working towards starting to get to the point of let's stop funding our demise and let's stop privileging the worst of the institutions. Then the next step is what is actually the positive pro-American agenda that's going to protect ideological dissent within all of these institutions. And we'll probably have to take positions that we might not have been comfortable taking 25 years ago. But if you view this as essentially ideological wartime and that the alternative is a death as a nation, then I think, suicide is not moral. It would be an argument that I would make, and I think an argument that conservatives ought to take to heart. And I think grassroots conservative voters and activists understand this to a far greater degree than do the politicians, because the politicians, I don't think, really see the effects of what's happening on the ground, which, as I've been writing about at length for the last couple of years, has been the weaponization of all of these institutions against us to target wrong thinkers like terrorists. And then apply terrorist enhancements, by the way, in trying to charge the worst of the bunch. So to that end, the first thing is realize the size, scope, and nature of the problem. The second step is stop growing the problem. The third step is provide solutions that are actually going to protect our most fundamental institutions. And they may not look the same at the end of the day, but they might better reflect at least, what Americanism ought to be in this society. So there's not a clear answer. It's not a simple answer. It's not, and I don't think, by the way, it's a simple, well, just, build your own big tech, build your own internet. There has to be some creative thinking about what you can do within the confines of existing structures and try to build alternative ones. But beyond that, when we do have actual political power, it certainly ought not to be used to further our death and destruction, but then it also has to be used in a positive way as well.
It's a great point. And I think part of the problem is that conservatives and Republicans have actually deviated from the idea of limited government. I mean, we see that the growth of government has led to the problems that we have today. And notice that we talk about education, healthcare, immigration, whatever the issue is. As government has expanded, it hasn't solved any of these problems. It's actually made them worse. And conservatives have and Republicans have this knee-jerk reaction almost that when something goes wrong in society, they look to government to solve the problems. And unfortunately, we've forgotten our founding. But you said something very important. When we look at the levers of power, so we have all this stuff going on in our society, academia, big tech, the corporate world. And at the same time, we see the weaponization of the Department of Justice. You wrote another fantastic article about the FBI gaslighting and Twitter files. And you talk about the idea of unapproved opinions. And one of the articles, what really stuck out to me was this idea that I used to work in Homeland Security and Emergency Management. I understand critical infrastructure protection very well. You now have the bureaucrats in power, officials, literally using the words unapproved opinions, and that there's now cognitive infrastructure. How terrifying is that, given everything else that we've discussed so far?
The notion of cognitive infrastructure, that exact phrasing, and I'm pretty sure you can see that on at least a couple government agency websites today, literally. This notion of cognitive infrastructure is something that emanates from the lips of the director of CISA. CISA is an agency most Americans probably are not familiar with, certainly not before the Twitter files revelations. But CISA sits under Department of Homeland Security. And it's supposed to be about cybersecurity and infrastructure security generally, protecting it in this country, which I think every American would say, great. Obviously, we have to be protected against cyber attacks. Our critical infrastructure has to be protected against the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, etc. What CISA has done, however, is extend its mission, as is always the case with every single bureaucratic agency, and but to most dangerous effects, certainly when it comes to our national security and law enforcement agencies. CISA has said that election infrastructure falls under its mandate, but that election infrastructure extends into matters of, if you question the integrity of our elections, you may well pose a threat to our election infrastructure. Consequently, you may be a threat. And so they take that, oh, people have dangerous ideas about election integrity, they could threaten and undermine our elections, our democratic institutions, to cognitive infrastructure is now a focus of CISA. And so that is literally the words that the director of CISA used in a speech back in 2021, essentially saying that cognitive infrastructure, almost verbatim, is our most critical infrastructure. And by the way, that notion of a cognitive infrastructure and about these dangerous ideas that could undermine our system is also baked into a document that is sort of the holy grail, I think, for this whole weaponization that not a lot of people focused on, but I focused on many times in my articles. The Biden administration's National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism. It's a pivotal document that every American ought to read. It's not particularly wrong, but that document in its final section talks about combating the long-term contributors to domestic violent extremism in this country. And it talks about essentially a pandemic of dis, and malinformation that undermines our vital infrastructure, our democracy. And so what you get into is, if you say that cognitive infrastructure is our most vital infrastructure, that is basically a mandate for mind control. I don't think it's hyperbole to argue that, because what you're saying is that if Americans believe things that you, the state, say are wrong or dangerous, then they ought to be policed. And of course, we've seen speech policing in myriad ways that started well before the intended creation of the DGB, the Disinformation Governance Board. And it goes obviously right to the core of the Twitter files. And by the way, of course, there are Reddit files, Google files, Wikipedia files, which we haven't seen yet. But we know that all these agencies were meeting with all the big tech companies to talk about, quote unquote, content moderation. That is censoring and silencing those who engaged in wrongthink on a whole slew of issues that the regime considers politically important. So this is where the rubber meets the road here. It's one thing if a truly private institution says we're not going to tolerate certain ideas, but it is another, and I think that's wrong, by the way, and I think those institutions should be combated, but it is a whole nother ballgame when it is government imposed censorship. It's a direct First Amendment violation, among violations of other laws as well, arguably, as I think Jed Rubenfeld and Philip Hamburger and others, legal scholars, have argued. But this notion of cognitive infrastructure, I think, is one of the scariest principles of all. The notion of, if you have the wrong ideas, and this goes back to the campus, by the way, campus, hate speech. Hate speech constitutes harm. It presents a danger, and thus we need to censor you.
Words
Same
of violence.
principle. Yes, words are violence. It's the same principle that applies in the government. So, they moved from essentially using foreign interference and someone propagating foreign propaganda as a justification to go against domestic opponents. They've now gone much further to cognitive infrastructure. Let's protect the American mind, harden it against that evil, icky, threatening dis, and malinformation, and use that as a pretext to silence dissent and to pursue wrong thinkers in this country. That is where the campus is now in our national security apparatus, and that puts you in a police state that makes America unrecognizable.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I'm so happy you brought up the national strategy. To me, it's one of the most frightening documents. It talks about anti-authority, anti-government sentiment. And if people don't remember, during the coronavirus, you had over 1,200 public health officials state that if you protest the government orders, the mandates, the draconian decrees, then you are promoting white supremacy. And in Pillars 1, it talks about creating a partnership with private sector companies and organizations to be the eyes and ears of government. In Pillar 2, it talks about the control of the supply and demand of information online, which goes right to censorship. It is one of the most terrifying documents, and I encourage everyone to read it because it doesn't get talked about enough. And just as a final question, Why don't Republicans and conservatives actually bring up this document to show how dangerous it is? And I suspect it's because many Republicans actually support this document.
Yeah, I think you're right. We're speaking now just after this whole speakers contest, and there's a resolution to create what has been described as a church-style committee. This resolution to create a committee on weaponization and a subcommittee in the House Judiciary Committee, which purportedly is going to get to the bottom, at least, of government big tech collusion. I say purportedly because it's very hard to trust the legislative branch to pursue these national security agencies with the gusto that they ought to for a number of reasons. One of which, as you mentioned, is they agree in principle with the ways in which they've been used to pursue wrong thinkers in this country, or they think that the threats that have been asserted in terms of the domestic threat of DVEs who are as you noted, anti-authority and the like, they actually agree with that view. But then I also think, as you noted in the schools, I do think that there's an element of trepidations about daring to run afoul of the national security apparatus. And by the way, legitimately so, because remember when Donald Trump himself early on threatened to go after the intelligence community, what did Chuck Schumer say? Chuck Schumer said they can get you 6 ways from Sunday. Lo and behold, before that point, Donald Trump had been pursued by the national security apparatus, even before he was elected president. And obviously, it continued through his presidency. And the tip of the spear of the efforts to pursue him came from the national security apparatus. Why? In part because they operate in secrecy. It's very hard to get to the bottom of their records. They can stonewall you. And beyond the stonewalling and the subterfuge and using redactions and forcing people to go down to a skiff and not be able to talk about the revelations they have unearthed, we now know, for example, we only now know, by the way, years after the fact, that some of the key investigators for the House Intelligence Committee who were getting to the bottom of Russiagate/Spygate, like Kash Patel, they themselves had their records subpoenaed. And you had the DOJ probing them at the very time they were probing the DOJ. And this is the problem with the weaponization of the national security apparatus and the politicization of it. It inherently has more power than any other part of government because it's using the most awesome surveillance powers ever created in the history of mankind. By its very nature, it has to operate in secrecy. It can claim, needs to protect sources and methods, sensitive information. If foreign adversaries get wind of what they're up to, it's going to imperil our entire society. And essentially, you have these agencies who can hoover up more data on every individual than ever before, can leak things to the press, and you can't really combat them easily once the leaks are out there. So for all these reasons, even if you are the most independent-minded, muckraker, courageous, squeaky clean record, unimpeachable elected official, think about the risks you run of going up against that awesome national security apparatus. And it's sad, by the way, because I'm as hawkish as they come in terms of defeating our adversaries. I've written at length about China and how we ought to be aggressively pursuing China using every lever of power. By the way, this administration, of course, ended the China initiative, which was a good thing, actually, that the FBI was engaged in. But when these institutions, as with the schools, end up being turned on their heads, and in this case, turned back on American citizens and view Americans, and particularly political foes, as the real adversaries to be pursued, using the powers that had been used to pursue our foreign adversaries, you've corrupted the entire apparatus. And so I think at the end of the day, there need to be truly steel-spined members of the House on this pending committee. And this pending committee, even if it does the best possible job in terms of exposing, unearthing the corruption and the like, there's still going to be little accountability, I think, because the most they will probably be able to do is make criminal referrals to a Justice Department that will basically tell them to pound sand with respect to those referrals. But nevertheless, the pressure against them is massive. And to top it off, where it used to be that you had a press, a liberal, truly liberal, and even a leftist press that was skeptical of these agencies, now the corporate media is essentially on their side. So you're going to have a massive onslaught from Democrats, from the media, from a substantial percentage of Republicans as well, who were going to say, how could you possibly go after these agencies, you radical extremists? And these agencies ought to be pursuing you because you're the problem in this country. So that's a real problem. Again, I hope there are steel-spined, courageous individuals who are sitting on this panel that's to come, and hopefully they get to the bottom of at least some of the corruption, the weaponization and politicization. But I think it comes down to your point, either they largely agree with what's been done, or they're deathly afraid of actually taking on these agencies because of the repercussions of doing so.
And Democrats are so short-sighted because they forget that in 2015, the CIA was spying on sitting members of the Senate Intelligence Committee, both Democrats and Republicans. That's how short-sighted they are. They don't realize that these tools can just as easily be turned on them as they have been on Republicans. Ben, I really appreciate you coming, take the time to speak with the audience. Author of American Ingrate. You got to check out that book, and I'd love to have you back on actually to talk about the book. I wanted to talk a little bit about it today, but obviously we ran long with other topics. But yeah, I'd love to have you back on to talk about the book.
And my pleasure. I apologize for filibustering, but you had me fired up. So thanks so much for the opportunity.
I want to thank Ben for joining me today, and I'm already looking forward to our next conversation because I really wanted to get into his book, American Ingrate, but we ran out of time. I suggest everyone reads the book and follow Ben's work. I have the links up at the P.A.S. Report website, PASreport.com. As always, please share this episode with family, friends, and on social media. If you find the podcast informative, give the P.A.S. Report a 5-star rating. Take 30 seconds to write a review on any podcast platform that allows it. I want to thank you for joining me, and I'll be back on Wednesday with another great episode of the P.A.S. Report.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast.
Have a good one. Bye.
Be sure to rate, share, and subscribe to the podcast so you'll never miss an episode. Also, visit PASreport.com and follow us on Twitter at PAS Report.